Now we on to the introduction to our speaker today, Chris Kleinjans. Mr. Kleinjans is a Community Impact Officer for the Allegan County Community Foundation, as well as former Ottawa County Commissioner, a former Ottawa County Commissioner. He has been working in the nonprofit community for over 25 years, primarily with at-risk populations, and he holds both a BS and an MPA from Grand Valley State University. So with that, I'll turn the microphone and the camera over to Chris Kleinjans.
Hello. This is encouraging because last week was pretty depressing. So it's nice to see that you're all very brave. Shameless plug for that program on the first. I've known Sarah for a while. I'm helping her with the audience assessment as they get ONN stood up. And she's awesome. You're in for a treat. So today is the second part of our discussion. Last week was a whole lot of trotting through how we got to the point that we're at today, which is what has increasingly becoming acknowledged as a housing crisis different than the housing crisis that we talked about that occurred in 2007. All indications are that housing as an issue will be an issue for easily the next 10 to 15 years for us as a country. It's a global issue as well. I was just reading a report from New Zealand. They're not doing so well either. Real estate prices in New Zealand are through the roof, and everybody wants the same things that they want here. So by way of just kind of give a through line, we're going to talk about sort of the way out and kind of like the things that can be done to help rectify the problem of housing in West Michigan. And then we're going to talk about some advocacy, about some things you can do to kind of like help move the needle, because this at its core will be a people-powered sort of change that is going to require thinking through a little bit of a lens. And as I've learned from doing advocacy with our elected representatives locally in Lansing and in Washington, sometimes they need assistance changing their lens to sort of see the reality of the people they represent. That's my nice way of putting it. And tied into that, I'm going to talk briefly about how three of the counties in West Michigan are addressing their housing shortages. We'll talk a little bit about how Ottawa's doing, what Ottawa's doing to deal with it, what my position in the goal of the Allegan County Community Foundation is in resolving our housing shortage, as well as what's going on in Kent County. Kent County just released their newest housing assessment last Friday. We'll do a quick review of that. Short story, it's not good. But, I want to start out with just a little bit, when last we left, the gang had discovered the monster, but had not quite taken the mask off the monster to find that it was the old man that was in it for money. So one of the things that popped into my email yesterday was the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies released their 2025 annual report of what to watch out for in the coming year. And I'm going to go through their eight high points because what you're going to see is every one of those is going to be reflected in what we're going to talk about going further down range. Their 8 takeaways from the new report is renter cost burdens are hitting a record high. And we'll talk about cost-burdened homeowners and renters in just a second. Higher costs are, there's just higher costs associated with home ownership, insurance and property taxes being one of them, but insurance in particular if you live in one of those areas that is prone to flooding and hurricanes. Home sales have dropped to a 30-year low. That should be interesting to all of us because if everybody wants a house, why are home sales falling? Builders have responded to this by building smaller homes. We'll talk about how that is helpful, but it's not quite working as well as it could. U.S. ownership rate falls as first-time buyers are currently being priced out of the housing market. Rental demand is strong, but construction is largely at the higher end of the market. We'll talk a little bit about how competing theories of what will help solve this sort of smash into each other. Reductions in federal support. So we talked a little bit about LIHTC funding last week. That is the federal program that helps developers build housing that they can then rent to usually very low income people. The other options are pilot and TIF. We'll talk a little bit about those, but those are absorbed by the local municipality. So reduction of LIHTC, or even not doing anything about LIHTC while the costs go up, is not helpful for low-income housing. And you're not going to believe this, but tariffs, reduced immigration, and diminished federal support create an uncertain future. Shocking. The Fed today announced that housing starts are down, reaffirming what Harvard pointed out. The estimated cost of the tariffs is expected to add $7,500 to $10,000 to the construction of a new house, which might not seem like much when the going rates for houses in Ottawa County are riding around $400,000, but every little bit helps or hurts, depending on your perspective. So when we left, we had kind of discussed how the housing crash sort of created this cascade of issues that then, we sort of cruised out of them after 10/30. That's when the recession that was caused by the bursting of the housing bubble officially stopped, and we coasted along pretty good right until we ran into COVID. During that intervening time, a lot of homes were taken off the market. They were purchased by private equity and bundled into large groups. So there's large multinational corporations that own a lot of housing stock, which allows them to sort of dominate a market. I was talking to a coworker, and if you go in the Ann Arbor or East Lansing areas, all of those houses around main campus are owned by one particular company, and at both campuses. And so it becomes competition in the market is stifled because it's owned by these houses were purchased up by people who had equity after the crash, which wasn't a lot of us, and they were able to purchase at lower prices. And as a result, they sort of can set the bar as to what the bar is going to be, and we all have to adapt to that. So there was the great buy-up along with the cascading events that resulted from the housing construction industry. So building trades fell. Michigan, West Michigan in particular, lost 30 to 50% of their building trades people during the recession, and then a little bit more during COVID. So we don't have enough skilled tradesmen and women and people to construct the housing that we need, even if we had the capacity, even if we had the capital. When you have a highly sought after skill, you can command higher wages. That's the way it works. So building trades is a very lucrative thing to be in right now. But barring that, it takes time to build up that core. So what, the end result of all of that is that what we found ourselves having is we have not built enough stock. So this kind of shows owner-occupied housing built by year. So a lot of the housing stock that we have now is old. And if anybody has ever owned an old house, they require a lot of love. A lot of love, a lot of maintenance, a lot of equity, sweat equity, money equity. We have a lot of old stock. The trouble is, if you look at this blue piece from 2010 or later, we have not... For a lot of decades, from really like the 70s on, we were replacing anywhere from 13 to 16% of our housing stock adding in. That means some of these old houses can go, unless they're in the historic district. Don't touch that. But in the last 14 years, we've only made 4% more housing than we had at that point. Housing ages out, blight reduction, and houses getting too old to be safe to live in is a common theme, particularly in rural areas. We see this a lot. And as a house comes off the market, if there's not one to replace it, that makes that increases that scarcity of resource. So we can't get them built as quick as we'd like because we don't have enough. For one reason, we don't have enough people to swing hammers. But as we are building that up, we're losing older stock exponentially faster than we've been able to put it back up. So that leads to this notion of cost burdened. When I purchased my house back in the 90s, my mortgage lender said that you should be able to, how was it? It was you were able to pay off all of your bills with your first week of pay and your rent with your second week of pay. Your rent or your mortgage should not constitute more than 1 week of pay. Cost burdened, which was mentioned in this report, 50% of renters nationwide are cost burdened. Cost burden is when you pay more than 30% of your monthly income specifically for housing. So that puts a pinch on everything. And it increases your likelihood that you will take shortcuts because housing is definitely a priority. In Ottawa County, 42% of renters and 16% of homeowners are cost burdened. In Allegan County, it's 37% and 18. In Kent County, it's almost half of renters and 20% of homeowners are cost burdened, which means that's that 30%. Now, that 30% isn't like the line. For example, for low-income residents, up to 76% of their income can be going specifically towards their housing. So there is a racial and ethnicity sort of component to this. We talked briefly about redlining last time and how redlining might not have been part and parcel of sort of creating communities where assets and capital didn't go into, but it certainly didn't help. So there is a component to this that has to do with race and ethnicity, but overscoring that, even if you look at the demographics within these three counties, this is overwhelmingly people of European descent in all of these counties. So this is, it's not, what I mean to say is it cuts across, in our area, it cuts across everything. So the rates of burden peaked following the recession because, a lot of those adjustable rate mortgages and other things went up through the roof. Then it decreased, but then COVID arrived, and COVID had the double whammy of pushing all of those pushing more people towards that cost burden level. When you hit that 30% plus, that is the allegory that we hear of. You are one car repair. You are one kid going to the emergency room for a medical thing. You are one thing away from not making your rent or another bill, which has a cascading effect. So we have that issue of the housing we have is expensive, and that gets into the why. And we sort of discussed this a little bit, but we finished off last week with this. We aren't issuing as many permits. Permits Ottawa County has seen a drop of 300 to 150 permits per year, depending on which township, for single family homes. Other types of housing that are considered to be more affordable. So for example, mobile homes, modular homes, multifamily homes, those have not been able to fill that gap. They haven't been able to fill that gap specifically because of zoning. So with that lack of permits, and I don't want to make this, there's reason why permits haven't been issued. One of the fundamental reasons is there's not enough money. Unless you're building anything more than a single family home for yourself that you went to the bank and you got a mortgage and you purchased the land and you got the contractor and all of it's coming out of one flat mortgage, you cannot build more than a single house. Most contractors that I know, they build what's called a spec house. They'll find the Someone will approach them, say, I'd like you to build me a house. They give them a bid. That person goes and gets the money. They build the house, and then they move on to the next one. Building a house blind has not been done since COVID, because you can't predict that house is going to sell, because for what you have to sell it for, you can't predict that there's going to be buyers. So when for going to pre-bubble, pre-housing bubble, this wasn't the case. Contractors would build houses knowing that the market was there, because the market was red hot and explosive, and houses were just going as quick as they could be put up. It's not the case now. If you're going to try and build anything bigger than a single family, and that actually means a duplex too, which could have almost the same square feet as a large single family, but it's actually two distinct units. You need that puts you in developer territory, and that means you need what's called a capital stack. Capital stack is generally required for anything more than a larger unit, and a capital stack is comprised of the debt and the equity that is wrapped into that project. So what that means is the debt and the equity are predicated off a few things. Land is expensive. In Ottawa County, land is super expensive because we're starting to run out. And we have a variety of competing interests for that land in the county that are all staking their argument on, this is what has made us a successful, fastest growing county in the state for the last decade. One of the things I was very fond of saying to people was that we need the discussion about how we use what we have left to get to a point that we're all happy should have probably started about 15 years ago, but instead we should be having it now, because we love our parks. Parks are awesome. Ottawa County parks kill it. We love our ag. I mean, we love our ag land. We're a very agrarian community, fifth biggest agrarian community in the state. We love our business and our manufacturing, because that brings economic diversity and economic drive to the area. And we love our houses. All of those can't compete when we're running out of land. And when there were always blueberry fields on the north side of town, this wasn't a big issue. Or when there were always soybeans over in Zeeland Township, this wasn't an issue. But if you've been to the east side of Zeeland in the township lately, that's almost gone now too. So land is expensive. Generally speaking, whatever you put on a piece of land has to be 5 times the cost of the piece of land to break even. So if you buy a piece of land for $20,000, you got a deal for starters. But you're going to you have to put $100,000 worth of house on that to cover your expenses. You're not going to get rich. Everybody's going to get paid. None of your checks are going to bounce. So anything over that is your profit. That increases the risk. So this is what in housing development, anything that when we're looking at like the things that solve the problem, which are every solution to this problem involves single family homes, duplexes, condos, multifamily, and mobile home, modular home. It involves everything. But for 90% of those, you need one of these. And this is just so the stack is risk. Your senior debt, which is the primary person who's putting up the money, they don't get a lot back on the deal. But if you're way up at the top and you're like the filling in the gap money, your risk is huge, because you don't get paid off until everybody else gets paid off. But because you wait, you get way more percentage. So the stack is required, and this can consist of a lot of things. So it can consist of private equity. It can consist of grant money. It can consist of a lot of things. But the fundamental piece is that if you were, I think about my grandpa, who was a contractor in Zeeland forever, and built one of the things he built was Zeeland Hospital, the old hospital that's sitting on a hill now. For him to build that now, he would have to do one of these. For him to pull one of those off, he would have to have backers, college education, a whole lot more than he had. This type of development is in scope, a little bit harder for most contractors in the area to pull out. So you need a development company. Which brings me to what I got to hear a lot about when I was on the campaign trail, because this was in my district, the Lakewood Village Place Apartments. So you may have driven by it. It's big. It's super big. And I can tell you for a fact that all these people around here are really honked off that they lost their woods. They're really mad. But that represents a $40 million project that it was led by Geerling's Development, which is private equity, KJK Real Estate Management, which is private equity, and they're going to run the apartments when it's done. But it's also supported by more private capital that we don't know, along with matching public investment. So they got money from the county revolving fund. They got LIHTC credits, and they received a TIF. So with a ratio for every $2 of private investment in that, $1 is public investment. What they get out of that is that 20% of the units in that development are slated to be reserved for people that are making from 80 to 120% of area median income. We're going to talk about definitions, and we talked about definitions a little last week. 80 to 120% of area median income. When I talk to a lot of people, they're like, oh, well, that's the poor people. No, that's your teachers, your firemen, your law enforcement officers, your middle management. That's anybody making area median income in Ottawa County is around 80,000. So it's anybody making 60 and above. That's not struggling. But that 2-to-1 ratio was required to get those 20 units to make that missing middle housing. Because this is a $40 million project. If this was all at market rate, the market rate rental for those is going to be easily over $2,500 a piece, because it's brand new and everyone wants the new bright and shiny. So, these things require a capital stack. This is also going to house 120 plus families and people. So this is a big Band-Aid to the problem. These are required, but because of cost, because of the finances involved, it took 5 years to pull this thing off. These don't just come together with a handshake. They take a lot of work. A lot of them fall apart. And the money is tied into permitting. You have to put about 20% of the project's total costs are put into before you even put the shovels in the ground for the photo op. It's going before the planning commission. It's asking for rezoning. It's getting the drawings that you need to show that your project should be rezoned, is good for planning. It's that's where 20% of things are wound up. Infrastructure, water and sewer. Infrastructure, to run new infrastructure, which is water, sewer, and road, not electric and not wireless. To run that, it's about $1,300 a foot, which is good for here because they only have to run it in. But if you're 100 yards away across the township line, that's $130,000 of investment that you have to have that has to be salted into the rest of your project. Material costs, the wood and the metal and the nails and the screws and all that good stuff. Inspections and hookups, code and land. So everything's big. Everything's big and everything costs more. A lot of these are controlled by the market. So for example, we get a large percentage of our raw board foot lumber from Canada, which now costs more because of the tariffs. We ran into this with drywall and with wire and with any number of things that we get from China. A lot of these are built into the cake. The labor shortage, that's baked into the cake. land costs, all of that is baked in. But there are things that we can do to lower this cost, and those are zoning and code. Effective zoning is arguably the biggest thing that citizen activity can do to help fix this issue. This is Holland's unified UDO. If you live inside the city, you remember this is kind of spicy discussion for a while. And what that meant to do was meant to take a whole lot of zoning stuff and make it a whole lot simpler for developers to come in, and then make a very clear roadmap for them to look at this and go, this is what I can do, this is what I can do, because at its core, that's what zoning does. It tells you what you get to do with a piece of dirt that you own. So, first established in 1918 in New York City, Michigan's zoning code wasn't established really until after World War II. So we haven't done zoning for a whole lot of time. It's a relatively new concept. So if anyone ever says, it's always been like that, they're wrong. That's kind of a dodge. What it's meant to do is it's meant to balance the needs of the community for residential, industrial, commercial, and ag, kind of like we just talked about the competing interests in Ottawa County. Exclusionary zoning is what we have typically done as far as our residential. Exclusionary zoning is when you use zoning to exclude certain types of land use from a given community, especially to regulate racial, but more in this area, economic diversity. If you've ever gone out to Laketown Township, in Laketown Township, to build in Laketown, you need 5 acres. They do not play around with that rule. If you have 4.9, you have to come up with another 1/10 somewhere. You can ask for it's called a non-conforming use, but 5 acres is your minimum to build. 5 acres of anything is genuinely pretty pricey. So if you work in Saugatuck as a cook and you want to live in the area near where you work because it's just easier for everybody, you will not be living in Laketown, because as someone who spent a lot of time cooking in Saugatuck, I can tell you we don't make that much money. So the economic diversity is the piece that gets stifled. So it creates communities where you just have to be at a certain level to get in there. And these aren't HOAs. HOA is a whole thing, and I don't even touch that. But this is largely it's largely created to keep people in spots. Exclusionary zoning ordinance are standard in just about every community. If anybody's ever tried to go to your zoning board of appeals for something, or gone to watch, because it's kind of like sometimes like a spectator sport, like Roman fights, you'll see that it's that getting something through planning, getting a zoning variance can be incredibly difficult. Zoning is meant to follow, if you're seeking a zoning change or an exemption from zoning, planning commissions are really reluctant to give that, simply because that sets precedent. They are very rule driven. And if the rule doesn't make sense, it doesn't really matter, because if you make an exception for one person, and it's not bulletproof, it's a slippery slope. So in North America, zoning was used right from the gate to protect middle and upper class neighborhoods and keep poor and ethnic and racial minorities households out of them. So that's when we think about the post-war, when we think about the Levittowns, the post-war suburbs. A lot of that was restrictive zoning that was designed to keep minorities in the city and open up the suburbs for mostly Europeans. Zoning and it's not a like a closed system. Real estate developers who make money off of these things, it helps them. Remember the 5-to-1 rule. If I have 5 acres of property in Laketown, chances are pretty good I'm going to build a house that's about $500,000 to start. So if I'm a developer, if I'm a contractor, if I have anything to do with the building industry, big houses on big hunks of land are just, it's like making your own money. Small houses on small piece of land, not so much, thinner margins. This is how we sort of get to this type of zoning. So this, this looks, I first saw this and I was like, oh, it's the north side, but, but it's not. But when we look at communities like those in West Michigan, which was a very agriculturally based community with small villages and towns in between, prior to really the end of the Second World War, when we really began our big economic boom, when they put the highway right through town and separated everybody, and oh, the cacophony of the hue and cry. Since then, in my time on the north side, I've watched all my blueberry fields go, and my blueberry fields all turned into subdivisions that I spent a lot of time canvassing. So that is a process that has been replicated across Ottawa County, a lot of Kent County, not as much as you'd think, because Kent County is kind of big, and absolutely not in Allegan County. This look is very much an Ottawa County thing, but it's coming soon to a theater near you in Allegan. And it sort of comes from people not wanting to be in the city anymore. So if you have the means and can leave the city, you want to go to the country because you like it. Typically, the way things have worked is a farmer in this kind of like developing period of an area will sort of look at their farm. If they aren't going to pass it down generationally, it kind of becomes a three-dimensional 401k. Because if their family isn't going to farm it, they're going to look at that and they're going to go, someday when I get tired of jumping on a tractor at 5:30 in the morning, I'm going to sell this and we're going to go to Florida. Solid plan, perfectly acceptable plan. People want to get out of the city. So when we think about Ottawa County, what is the hottest growing area of Ottawa County? It has been for a while. Hudsonville, Georgetown. All of that field, all that land in there. And who's moving there? Are people from Grand Haven moving there to get back to the country? Grand Rapids. Lighton Township in Allegan County is the fastest growing township in Allegan County, and it is because you can get to the center of Grand Rapids in 30 minutes. Gun Plain Township, which is the third fastest growing township in Allegan County, and has with a population of like 3,500. We're not killing it down there. But they are about 25 minutes from the center of Kalamazoo. So it is people moving out of the urban centers to get to that rural character that attracts new residents, that increases housing development. The area becomes more residential. Prices go up because now there's not so much land left, and the farmer, and it becomes a cycle. Eventually, the other farms in the area get tired of their neighbors complaining, "Why does everything smell like poop in the spring?" And then they get out of the business, which opens up more land, and all of a sudden, it's all gone. Typically, what we've seen is a farmer would take a 50-acre parcel was about the standard in Ottawa. They would sell 5-acre chunks along the outside, and then farm the middle. And then when they wanted to really get out all the way, they'd sell that middle, and that would become that subdivision that we all kind of like recognize. They were called estate farms. They're still called estate farms because if you wanted to, you could farm. 5 acres allows you to farm. You could have a goat, a horse, if you were really into that sort of thing. It was a big size, and it allowed a township to keep its rural character without having density. So. But when that last component, that middle, what I call the big squishy middle of that piece of property, was ready to go, it was usually sold to a developer and turned into an entire subdivision of smaller lots on maybe one house per acre. So that's how this sort of cycle begins. And one of the things that we see now is rural communities, and I run into this all the time. Well, very consistently, we'll say, in Allegan County, is that they've kind of watched Ottawa County and have adopted there's just no way that's going to happen ever. And that's exclusionary just by, and so zoning is local. And you can make zoning exclusionary just by making it so impossible to acquire the land, or so expensive if you do acquire it. I think I mentioned this last time, agricultural land is going for $10,000 an acre in Allegan County right now. And if you're going to buy a house, you might as well plan on paying 20 an acre to start, because there's just, the zoning has created such tight confines for housing development that if you want it and you're going to go through the hassle of getting it rezoned, you're going to pay for it. So, which sort of gets us to, these are your rural estates, and then your subdivision inside. These are from my former employers at MSU, who do a great job in talking about how zoning works. I'd recommend you go to the MSU Extension website. They have long discussions that are way more in depth on how zoning works in the state of Michigan. They teach on it. They do a lot of really good work in this area. So the better way to solve this is through inclusionary zoning, which is really just like a code shift. It's a land use policy that encourages developers to either A, include a certain percentage of affordable units in new residential developments. That's the 20% in the Lake Town apartments, but it doesn't necessarily have to look like a percentage of units. A lot of it can be structure. So along with that comes fixing zoning where people are already living. Expanding allowable uses, which is what can I do with this piece of dirt that I own? The utilization of accessory dwelling units, which is called missing middle housing, their granny cottages, their student housing. They have a number of different names. Reduce lot width and area requirements. Reduce or eliminate minimum dwelling size. How big, I own a piece of land. How big can I build it? And the elimination of parking minimums, which is something that you wouldn't think would be an issue until you do. So expanding allowable uses is kind of key to this. It essentially says, unless you're going to put up something, unless you're going to put up, like, I don't know, a tannery, for example, right next to in a residential area, no. But if you're just putting housing, if you're just putting a place for people to live, that's fine. Doesn't matter. It can look like the Emerald City. It doesn't matter. It's for housing. All housing matters in a place that is zoned for housing. So if you look at, for example, the City of Holland zoning map, there's R1, R2, and R3. R1 is single family. R3 is multifamily. This would take away all those numerical designations and say everything's residential. If you've got, so for example, we'll take the spot that's next to the Park Theater, the parking lot that's gone through a couple of iterations of it was going to be affordable, and then it really wasn't, and then it's kind of in limbo now. If they wanted to put under inclusionary zoning, if they wanted to put a cottage court, so for example, they cut that parking lot in half and they put a bunch of little cottages in a circle, kind of like a little bit of shielding from the road. That's an acceptable use. There's no lot requirements. There's no square footage requirements. It's smaller houses, maybe 900 to 1,200 square feet, but it fits. That's what exclusionary zoning does for you. It frees up the idea of what a piece of land can do that's not restricted to things like the width and area requirements. So width is, in the City of Holland, I think it's 300 feet. Lot's got to be 300 feet, and it's got to be a certain depth. And your side yards have to be X. You can't build up to your property line. You've got to have room for maintenance. Over in the township, your setbacks on your house are I think it's 150 feet. So if you go onto my street, for example, which is a post-World War II development, and you stand at my house and you look right down the street, every house is 150 feet back from the front of their property line. Why? I've got no idea. But that's the way the zoning was. So what that does is, oh, and I also I have a setback in the back. So, which I think is 200. So that kind of like says, this is the size of a house you can build because you have to have this much in front and you have to have this much in back. Well, if I had that extra 300, 400 feet, I could do something with that if I was feeling like it. I could expand. I could put an accessory dwelling unit on it. Accessory dwelling units, a lot of times these were, I mean, it's kind of funny. I think about 8 is enough. Like that dude lived in an accessory dwelling unit above a garage. But it can be a basement conversion, which is my neighbor's putting in a basement conversion now. It can be you take the garage and you convert it into housing. It can be you put an attached or a detached house, small house in the back and rent that to a Hope student. Or it can be, we're empty nesters. I've got a big house. I don't even go into that back half of the house all the time. I'm just going to wall up this door and I'm going to rent it out. And in doing so, I double the number of people that can live on this one piece of land. In doing so, now if there's several residents I've talked to in Allegan that are older and they have way too much house. And they want to get out. But what they're afraid of is if they sell and they buy a condo or they buy something smaller, they're going to lose that homestead exemption tax and their tax rate's going to fly through the roof with their new purchase. There's a solution to that lies in the Michigan legislature if they just kind of like grab onto it. But in the meantime, if you can take 5,000 and maybe all those apartments in the core city that are up and downs, if you take, that, and all those conversions took place in the 50s or 20s, 30s. Those are all that is ADU in. That's exactly what it was meant to do. It doubles the occupancy of those houses. It takes the pressure off. It increases the equity of the house because equity is the equity in your house is based on the demand for where you live, which is why core city prices are still and will remain incredibly elevated because younger homeowners want to be in a walkable city. They like the north side and they'll live there. But when my niece moved back here from Indiana, they bought in town because they wanted to walk to everything. So this idea of an ADU is a way to increase both occupancy in an area and relieve some of that. Now, if, for example, let's see, so looking at our converted garage and detached, if this is my lot on the north side, at this point, up until recently, I couldn't build that detached ADU because I have to have that setback on the back. So I can't build on that, even though I'd really, really like to. Now, zoning change fixes that. And that was one of the big controversies when the city of Holland went to the universal, was that it opened up those back ends. There's cautionary tale for that. If you ever go to Saugatuck, there's a lot of ADUs that are hiding in the back of existing houses that are being used for Airbnbs. So ADU has kind of become synonymous with Airbnb, particularly in like Park Township, a little bit in Holland Charter Township. So that is problematic, but you can zone for ADUs for residential. You can make the code fit what you want it to do. It doesn't have to be like Wild Westy. It can do the thing that you want it to do. But this is a really great way to find housing for people that would typically be renters because it's your Hope students that aren't going to be that might find a job and stay. They might not. It could be someone who's in town for 6 months working on a job. They're working on, they're trying to get the nuclear power plant back online. It could be someone who's here and he's a young professional that's like, I'm not sure if this job's going to work out and I don't want to commit to much. They don't need a lot of space. And there's a reason they call them granny cottages. It's also older citizens. So there's a lot of application for this, but that frees up a rental unit for a family, or for, it opens the scope a little bit. Reducing lot width allows you to do something that's called infill. Infill is just, I bought a double lot because that's the way it was zoned when I bought it, and I'm tired of mowing that thing. So you can put an ADU or a full-size house in there. You can fit a 2-story row house in between those two buildings that matches up with those two perfectly. You can put an ADU in this one. Where we see this out in rural areas is there was this period during the 80s when everybody had to have a pole barn. I don't know why, but everybody's got one out there. If we encourage people that purchase those to split the lot, sell that half, drop the pole barn and put another house there. Again, we have land, there's infrastructure. The other piece that works with these is they're all generally located, all these changes are generally located where there's already existing infrastructure. So you're not paying that $1,300 per foot to get it to this new piece. It just has to attach into an existing line. Why parking? If you've ever been to a Strong Towns or heard about the Strong Towns movement, it's a very, it was started in Minnesota by a very nice gentleman who worked in development, and its focus is on bringing housing back to the to the core city areas. And one of his biggest things is he has all of everybody that's into this go out on Black Friday and take a picture of the parking lots around, because all of our parking for commercial is built for Black Friday. It is built for one day out of the year. All of that space, all of that maintenance, all of that heat absorbing asphalt, all of that exists for 1, maybe 2 days out of the year, but it's zoned, that parking is zoned. So if you want to put up a multifamily house, for example, and you have 2-bedroom apartments, it's like, okay, well, 2 bedrooms, you got to have 2 parking spaces per house. Well, no, we think you ought to have 3, because what if it's a couple and, well, no, maybe then we should make you have 4. Parking is space. The more space you have for parking, the less space you have for living, for building rooms or for building space to live. And the less likely it is that a developer is going to go, well, if I've got to have 6 spaces per unit, what's the point? So this is D&W right after the work got out yesterday because it rained, and 2/3 of their parking lot is not used. That is, I think that's Walmart. And then, oh no, that's Walmart. That was right before, I think that was heading up to work. But the next time you go to, whether it's a big box, look at the amount of parking that's actually in use. That parking could all be something. And if it doesn't necessarily have to be housing, but if there was more commercial there, where could housing go? It's what do we do with the space that we have, where there are the things that we need: water, sewer, electric, road. So the reduction or elimination of parking minimums is a huge component of trying to get this done. These are 5 things that nibble on the edges, but cumulatively have a really big impact. For code, one of the things, code is meant to keep us safe. I have a developer acquaintance of mine. He's a libertarian. I love him because he has issues with code. I mean, he has lots of things to complain about, but he is right in a couple of things that code can protect us, but it can also be an impediment. Kent County is very adamant about the elimination of, and this has come out of the East Coast a lot, the elimination of dual stairways for multifamily housing, particularly if it's under 3 stories, which around here is most multifamily housing. Dual stairways came into play in the early 20th century for a very good reason, because multifamily was made of lath and plaster that went up like a Roman candle if it caught fire. So you needed two staircases, you needed two means of egress, or else people were gonna perish. Modern building, modern multifamily has fire suppression built into just about every component of its construction, from the grade that you use to build the walls and the framing, to sprinkler systems that are integrated into the structure itself. Dual staircases are a redundant system. Now, if any of you know Chief Tinney, he's going to tell you that I'm wrong, and that's his job. But what I do know is that this and this are another two apartments. And if you have a two-sided building with two staircases on each side, you have 4 more apartments there. So the reduction of a dual staircase allows you to create more space for living. Now, yeah, fire inspectors do not like this idea, but when we look at the statistics of fires in both multifamily and and larger houses that have means of egress, very rarely is that second staircase ever used, because, I mean, if you've watched them build a hotel, that both staircases are made out of concrete. They're fire resistant. They're the first thing that goes up. The rest of the building essentially hangs off them. The means of egress is about the safest part of that building. So you don't necessarily need two, but the elimination of the one gives you a lot of extra square feet to do something a little bit more productive with. All of these are small, kind of like small chunks, small things that can create the momentum, because there's no silver bullet to this, right? The solutions to a lot of our housing issues, I do believe that there is a governmental, the government at the federal level and the state level does have a piece to play in this, but it's only going to come from agitation at the ground level. Local control is important. And we'll talk a little bit about how the state how you can help the state with its local control issues, to kind of eliminate how to turn that NIMBY, which is exclusionary zoning and not in my backyard, into more inclusionary zoning, which is YIMBY and BIMBY. YIMBY is yes in my backyard, and BIMBY is build in my backyard. But it's the key is kind of understanding that these small things in the system will create the change. Part of that is the language. One of the first things I ran into, and I came out of food security, so when you talk to people about being hungry, everybody gets it. When you talk to people about food, all of a sudden there's a whole lot of perceptions that are built into the lens that it gets seen through. So when I'd walk up to someone and talk about workforce housing, for example, workforce housing is typically a home that we would call a starter home. It's a Levittown home. It is 900 to 1,200 square foot. 900 to 1,200 square foot is was what we built in this country really up until the mid 80s-ish, around there. When we started getting to, 2,000, 25,000, 2,500, 4,000 square foot houses. And we've lost the notion that you can live like a human in 1,200 square feet. It's actually quite possible. I did it and raised 2 boys. So, but when you say workforce housing and you talk about houses that small, they immediately think, oh, that's low income housing because of the size. Workforce housing is that 80 to 120% of area median income. It is the people that make your community go. It's the people that make your community thrive to a certain degree. It's like, well, workforce housing is a tiny house. A tiny house is anything under 600 square feet. So the tiny house initiative that's being run by the Office of Strategic Impact and up at Fillmore is focusing on those homes. Now, 600 is small, SM all. But I can tell you that in Plainwell, last month, I watched a presentation that was 2 presentations that were delivered by 2 different development groups for use of the paper mill site. because they're finally getting to what they're going to do with that now that it's not a Superfund site anymore. And one of them was pretty straightforward, single family houses, boom. The other one was mixed, mostly condos. But what I really liked, what I really keyed into was the developer saying, because they had a single family component, and he was saying, someone from the gallery was like, well, so what are the sizes of the houses going to be? And he's like, we don't know yet. We're going to talk to the people in the community. We're going to find out what they want. Because he essentially said, we did a little walking around and talking to people, and we ran into some nice widows that were like, I just want a place with a kitchen and a bathroom and a bedroom. I don't need a lot. 600 square feet would do it. They'll turn if they get that, if their bid goes through, if they get that contract. And on that single family is going to be that inclusionary zoning where there will be small houses, because there is a market for 600 square foot houses. That's not just hippies. That's for people that don't have a high degree of need, don't want to put a lot of, just have stuff they'd rather do than take care of something that's bigger than that. So that is a tiny house. It's but the language is important. So missing middle is that 80 to 120%. TIF. If you've been following not the shenanigans, the doings of the county board of commissioners, TIF has come up quite a bit lately. So a TIF is a tax increment finance. This is not a new thing. It has been around for a while. Our DDA operates off a TIF. A TIF has traditionally been done through EGLE, which is the Environment, Great Lakes. So the people that handle our natural resources, kind of like the DNR, but not, because they also handle nuclear waste. So take, for example, not the paper mill, because that's a Superfund site. But if you have a place that needs environmental remediation, it's an old farm. These are good ones. It's an old farm. It hasn't been farmed for a while, but the developer comes on, he does what's called a phase 1 inspection, and he finds out where the underground fuel storage tanks were that they didn't tell him about. That needs to be remediated because that's contamination that has a health impact that needs to be taken out. So the initial tax increments financing was made for commercial use. So all of these industrial properties inside cities that had, Western Machine is a great one because, the dirt under there, we all know that dirt wasn't good. For that to be anything, it had to be remediated before it could be, which meant clean it up and you can put a new commercial building up there. The new TIF, which came out 2 years ago from MSHDA, which is the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, it is that with an extra layer. The extra layer is if you can apply for tax increment financing and you can apply for it for housing, because the EGLE TIF was only for commercial. You can apply for it for housing only if a percentage of your units are for missing middle occupancy. So the Lakewood Boulevard has a TIF because 20% of those units. 20% is the bare minimum. It would be nice if it was 25, 30%, but the reason that they kept it at 20% is because that still allows the developer to break even, to cover the costs of that capital stack. So how it works is, if you know it was on, that lot that Lakewood's apartments are going on, that sat empty for 30 years. The taxable value of that was probably like, I don't know, $1.50. Nothing on it except that big concrete block forever. As the developers improve that site, the taxable value goes up. Holland Charter Township, in entering into a TIF with the developers, said, okay, we're not going to take that taxable value as it increases. We're going to pay you for what you invested into this to make it happen. Now, where, for example, Coopersville last winter, I think it was 40 or 50 apartments in Coopersville that were just inside the city. So it was a perfect spot in existing infrastructure, close to really good project, had been approved by the city council, had gone through the county's Brownfield Redevelopment Authority. And all it had to do was get through planning committee before it went up to the full board for approval. They were able to confuse the issue because TIF doesn't, the amount they're being reimbursed doesn't cover everything. It covers that infrastructure piece, so the lines they're running in. It covers if they find any extra remediation that has to take place that didn't get picked up on the phase one. It covers, they get reimbursed for that. They get reimbursed for the money they've already put in, the planning, the go into zoning, the stuff that everything they've already invested in the project, the landscaping, the hardscaping, curbs, gutters, sidewalk, all of that is considered infrastructure. It's not the buildings. It's not the entire cost of the project. It is designated components of it. But what happens is as the Lakewood project gets developed, and even now, even though there's not a soul living there, that land is worth more than it was because someone did stuff to it. Holland Charter is not collecting any of that tax revenue because that is being reimbursed to the developer because they applied for a TIF and they're getting, and in return, the township is getting getting some missing middle housing out of the deal. Until that cost is paid back, the township won't realize the new taxes on that incredibly huge $40 million development. But as soon as it's paid off, all that tax revenue reverts back. A typical TIF can last up to 20 years. Most of them go 12 because the developer doesn't want to do it that long. But what it does is, and this is where Coopersville flew off the rails, is that a group of citizens showed up and said, the developer's ripping us off. And they kind of tried this with the development in Hudsonville on the farmland that is just getting ready to kick off. The developer's ripping us off. If the developer wasn't there, if the developer wasn't on Lakewood, the township would still own a piece of dirt with a concrete block on it that was taxable for $1.50. You can't lose something that you do not have. You have that because the developer's putting it there. In return, the developer gets some very specific costs reimbursed to him. And in return for that, you get some housing that you know you need. There's this churn because, the idea is that, well, we're going to have 100 and some more people living in the township. That means we have to pay the sheriff's department more for more road wear, more this, more that. True. But when you do, the moment that TIF is cleared and you're all of a sudden realizing $40 million worth of taxable value as opposed to 10, you can make up the difference. In the meantime, your schools don't suffer for the new students that come in because student funding is apportioned by student. It's not part of the tax base. So TIF is a huge component. It's going to be a huge mover of this, but there is a lot of disinformation about it because it's a really good way to stop something very fast. It plays into some pre-existing conditions that developers are greedy. They're all up for themselves. They want to take everything they can get out of the community and run the other direction. Most of the developers I've met and most of the people I know that have worked in this space longer than I have, as a rule, developers are a pretty honorable crew. With any group of people, you're going to find some people that aren't the best. After this, if you want me to tell you about how the contractor that built the house I now live in cut 10 square feet out of the middle of it between when my stepmother's family signed the contract and when when the house actually got built, he cut 10 feet out of the middle of it. And he was, as my dad put it, he was a Dutch contractor. But it plays into some pre-existing tropes, but TIF is really going to be a way to fill that missing middle gap and get us out of this mess a little bit because it does help create more housing capacity. Ryan Kilpatrick, who is the president of Flywheel Development, along with the director of Housing Next, which does housing development for Kent and Ottawa County. His ethos is based in the notion that more housing is better, even if it's expensive housing, because just more units will create more churn, which will create more opportunity for people to get into housing. I agree with that to a point. I do feel that there's a federal or a governmental response that would help this. So that leads into sort of how we're dealing with it. Ottawa County has a housing commission that is in the process of being reformed. We'll see what happens to that. They reformed it 2 years ago and they didn't do a lot. They also have a $10 million revolving fund, which they created with the ARPA funds. That fund is projects borrow from that for what's called gap funding. Gap funding is if you get federal funding, there's always like a break between when you're approved and when you actually get the money. This funds a project through that gap so things don't start and then stop and then start up again. And then they pay that money back typically with no interest. Ottawa County's ARPA revolving fund is held by a company called IFF, which is a nonprofit bank focused specifically on housing and nonprofit development. So Kent County has a similar model, but they also have something that focuses specifically on Grand Rapids. In Allegan County, they opted, I say they because this all occurred before I got here. They opted for a different sort of approach. All the counties that I just mentioned in West Michigan do housing needs assessments. They are all done by a company called Bowen National Research, which does a lot of the assessments in the Midwest. They're a very, very good company. They take a whole bunch of data and they kind of like scrunch it and chop it up, and they say, this is your housing situation. Allegan County, prior to 2022, had never had a housing assessment done. Ottawa and Kent both had assessments. They're on their second assessments now. So really, up until post-COVID, your housing thing, no one really worried about that too much because, remember the pie chart? Housing was coming. It was online. It wasn't a really big deal. What the 2022 Allegan County Housing Assessment did, which was it was a partnership with the County Board of Commissioners who wanted to get a better handle sort of on what they'd been hearing. The foundation fundraised for it and then commissioned the study. And it came out in 2022 and it showed that we're 6,200 units short of housing of all types. Now, I thought that was a big number, but then Ottawa County came out with theirs 2 weeks ago. And Ottawa County is currently 16,464 units short of housing of all types. But they've built or commissioned 5,700 units since the last assessment in 21. Grand Rapids is 25,039 units behind, or has a need of 25,039 units, and they've built or have approval for 6,400 units since 2021. So what this sort of says is that even though we've put incredible effort into filling the hole, the demand is filling the hole up faster than we can bail it out. So that's why some of these small ball approaches, that's where they really become important, because big development is going to be really hard because no one's running infrastructure right now, not at $1,300 a foot, and municipalities aren't going to take that investment on. There's no state revolving funds to run that kind of thing right now. So it takes time to create that infrastructure on a regional basis. So, the 90s when they were putting up the new roads and just running the line under them when they built those roads, that's not going to be happening around here. So working where there is existing infrastructure is really going to be the key to bringing more units online, along with keeping the cost to where it's achievable by the average person. And also reading, I'm really grateful that Kent and Ottawa County came out with theirs because it makes my job seem a whole lot easier. I only got to come up with like 6,200 units. How hard can that be? So, um, what the next step, Bowen had some next step recommendations. And the first one was to find a subcontractor like Housing Next to handle the convening the conversation in Allegan County, because it's a lot of this. It's a lot of demystifying how we got here and the ways to get out of it. The other, and barring that, Bowen suggested hiring a housing champion. So that was in 23. And about a year ago, I found myself looking for a job, and and I had been doing some work with strategic planning for food security with the foundation while I was still with MSU. And the person I was working with was like, this might be you. This might be your next spot. And so I came in September, and I've been doing this for 10 months. And in that 10 months, what I've done is I've convened, there's 33 individual municipal units in Ottawa County or in Allegan County. So many. Why? I mean, a Hopkins Township and a Hopkins Village, is it really necessary? Anyway, I digress. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of local units of government in West Michigan and Michigan as a whole. That's sort of our sweet spot. But I've read all of their master plans. Your master plan is your area's plan it covers typically 10 years, and it says, this is what we want to do in the next 10 years. It's a political document and a planning document. So if you read it and it goes, that sounds like they don't want any housing at all, that's exactly what they don't want. That's exactly what they're saying. So what I do is I try and convene I do two things. I talk to local municipalities, elected leaders at the state level, the national level, and the local level. And I also work outside of the county to try and draw attention into the county to develop housing, because one of the things I've noticed is that Allegan County is just far enough away from Grand Rapids and just far enough away from Kalamazoo that it's kind of a pain to get to. So if you're going to come, you're going to come for a reason. My job is to get out there and create the reason, or create at least the interest for you to come. So that's the advocacy outside, and act as a conduit between the state, federal, and local entities to sort of expedite the housing that the residents feel they need. We don't tell anybody what kind of housing they ought to have. That's up to them to decide. But one of the things that is very typical, that is the same for both Ottawa and Allegan County, is that we need to prioritize the use of our land in a manner that is going to allow us to have the type of community we want. I mentioned last week that prior to about a year ago, the only place my son could afford to rent and live was in Otsego, which was a real pain because that's where my grandson is, and it was an hour drive one way, and I'm selfish. So when he moved to Zealand Township, I was super happy because now it's only a half an hour, and he's in the county. I want my grandson in the county. That was half my goal for running for county commissioner, was I want to make housing cheaper so my grandson lives closer. I want that for everybody in Allegan County. So as we move forward, with the remodeling of the housing commission, it'll be a good thing to keep an eye on to see how deeply the county leans into the space, because having done this for about 10 months, I can tell you that a municipality that is Holland is doing everything it can, to put more housing up. They are working it. Holland Charter Township is doing the same with a slightly different mindset and goal. But there are a lot of townships that have no staff. They have a part-time staff, part-time supervisor, secretary, treasurer, don't have a deep resource base. So if they want housing, they don't have the resources to go out there and get it. There is benefit to looking at your housing from a countywide scenario, because at the end of the day, we're not just little cities. We're all in this kind of ecosystem together. Yeah, maybe when it took a half an hour to get from Holland to Zealand, that was kind of a thing, but we're all connected now. So looking at housing from a wider perspective allows for solutions for all of us, or allows for access to solutions for all of us, because that 13,000 or that 16,000 units, it's not going to come out of Holland Park and Holland Charter Township. It's going to require it's going to require some West Olive participation, and it's going to require some Coopersville participation. The West Side's kind of been carrying the weight for housing development because everyone wants to live here. But if we're going to find a solution, the entire county needs to be at the table and engaged. And when you look at it from a township perspective, it's too easy to just say, it doesn't apply to me. To that end, I want to introduce you to representing Christine Grant. She's a representative that represents the city of Grand Rapids. And if you were going to do an advocacy thing, this is what I'd suggest you do. In 2024, she introduced a package of 4 bills focused specifically on housing that did not make it. They made it to the floor and then the session ended. She plans on reintroducing this package at some point this year. The 4 bills focused on limiting parking requirements, limiting minimum parking requirements. So essentially, it eliminates parking requirements at all. It prohibits requirements for repeated studies. This is something that planning commissions will do for a development. They'll say, the developer will roll in and he's like, look, I got my phase 1, I got my phase 2, and they're going to say, you need an EPA inspection for non-native plants in Umpty Scrunch, which is going to cost you about $10,000. Come back when you have one of those. And when they come back with one of those, say, well, that's great. Now you need repeated studies are a way for municipalities to just make it cost prohibitive and just very discouraging for a developer to come in and do a project that they are zoned to do. The 3rd bill allows duplexes in zone single family. Now that can be a stacked 2. It's only a 2. It's not a 3 or a 4, but it's a duplex on the same spot that a single family residency could occupy. And it also revises protest petition requirements in cities and villages. So what we have seen recently in West Michigan, specifically in Coopersville, everybody in the Coopersville City Council kind of lost their job over that apartment, that apartment complex that everyone was for until they were against it. You can, where's the other one? Was it Grand Rapids? I forget. Jennison? There was a petition that just went around that was like essentially going to say if the city wants to do X as far as housing, they have to have X number of public hearings. Again, it's roadblocks to the development process because remember that 20% is bound up before you even break dirt. So anything that makes that 20% larger just discourages people from coming in and doing the project. So these are, again, small ball pieces that can have a big impact and can help take a little bit of the outrage out of some of these discussions and get more to that inclusionary zoning type of idea that we're trying to get to. Because at the end of the day, whether we're living in a single family or an apartment or a condo or a tiny home, we all really sort of want to be. We want to go back to that quote from the first session where, it's the place where we feel safe. It's the place where we're at our best. And these things are going to be the things that get us there. Thanks.
Well, we're kind of winding down here. Does anybody have any questions? I've got a roving mic here.
So, Chris, explain though a little bit more why a minimum. I'm still having trouble with minimum parking requirements. I mean, when you said it expands, I get it. But what if you're in a city and people are parking on the street? It makes a problem in winter. Traffic can be an issue, to see around cars and things.
So that's a really good point. And you can devise ordinance to kind of like make that work. The minimum parking isn't so important as is to not have like maximalist. The city manager of Allegan County sort of like really put it to put it in very, very succinct terms for me. And he's like, we have 10,000 people come here for the 4th of July. We have parking for 6. Somehow they all find a place to park. It's, we're a creative people. We'll find parking. The city of Saugatuck, or the village of Saugatuck, they do not have a lot of like private parking, and they do even odds to handle snow clearance and things like that. There's ways you can create it. The thing is with the parking piece is that it's an exclusionary practice that just kind of like allows you to make more than you're ever going to need, and that's just wasted space. But yes, I agree with the minimum piece. Yes, sir.
I can give you an example. At the United Methodist Church here in town, we've been looking at affordable housing, and parking was a part of the problem there. One of the ways that we could have solved the problem was to create a way to cross the street to the parking that's there along 9th Street, and got an initial no on that. But if we'd been creative and that had been allowed, that would have helped the parking situation. The other thing is, if it's those people are working downtown, they don't need they can do without a car, and there's bus service, for other kinds of workforce. So, there's creative ways to do that. And if you eliminate some of that minimum, then, that helps things. My other question is, in Allegan County, does the 502 program help some of that, or is there too many restrictions on that? Does it allow for multi-family kinds of projects and some of that?
If you look at master plans across the county, typically in Allegan, every municipality will have a multifamily chunk, and that's the pre-existing mobile home park. Because no one zones for more of those, although they just did down in Van Buren County. But yeah, it's a lot of it is just getting that R1 designation changed, and that works. That's a line that 502 doesn't work through. So.
Chris, a question that always comes to my mind when I hear presentations or read. I have trouble defining the term affordable housing. What, from your perspective, goes across the table when you say that topic?
So, good point. So like I mentioned, area median income in Ottawa County is roughly around 80,000, and so that's your average family size. So that's 2 plus the children, but they don't count because they don't work. That allows you to afford. I think I brought that post-it with me. So the way that when you figure out how much mortgage you can handle, you take the area median income, multiply it by 0.30 and divide it by 12. So in Ottawa County, the person making the average can afford a mortgage of roughly $2,185 a month if they have no other expenses, no student loan, no car payment, no insurance payment, none of that other stuff. If they're just paying for their house. When you add those other expenses in, it lowers your threshold. So this is based off of kind of like how HUD operates it. Now, when you go into, and so when you look at that, the average house that an Ottawa County resident can afford if they make dead center minimum with a minimum amount of extra debt is around $320,000. Average household price, starting price for sale in the county right now is 4. So that's when we talk about the affordability piece. And again, I had another developer point it to me this way. He's like, what happens is everybody goes just a little bit above what they can get because that's what they can get. So you work a second job and you do the things that you got to do. But what it does is it creates that tenuous situation. Whereas if you make less than 60% of AMI, you have very difficult problems finding housing in the county right now. But it is a metric that is put out by HUD, and you can, like, if you go to Rocket Mortgage, or you can punch in all kinds of numbers and find out just how hard it might be to find. Yeah.
Any questions from this side of the room?
Allegan County is such a mixed bag. I mean, you know,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we have the ultra poor and we have the ultra rich. And in Saugatuck Douglas, where I live, we have extreme need for a lot of service and industry jobs. And, you know, it's hard for people to find housing close enough to be able to accept those jobs, especially when you're talking about, you know, like maybe even being out of county. So, you know, is that being addressed anywhere?
So the discussion is being had. The trouble is kind of like the jumping off point of the discussion. And I'm not going to get into a lot of specifics, but a municipality close to you is looking at trying to find missing middle housing. And they had a planning commission meeting on it last month. And an advocate that sits on my housing stock work group called me up the next day and was livid because the initial price points for those units was way past 100% of area median income. So it didn't even fit missing middle. But you're right, land is expensive along the lakeshore, and it's expensive along the 31 corridor. And that puts Allegan in a very unique situation, in that between the resort community along the lake and the fact that the real estate market along the east side of the county is hot because of the highway, those are skewing every price inside the county. So if you live in the middle Allegan Township area, you're in trouble. And that's what we do see, is also that incomes, it skews our county median income, because those wings make more money than the middle of the county, because a lot of those jobs are service jobs that are local. The longitudinal effects of that are, when I talk to AISA, under fives coming into the school system are not replacing the over 18s going out. So we are having a slow drawdown of youth in the county that aren't being replaced by, our high school graduates aren't being replaced by kindergartners, which it's a trickle. It's not like a 5-alarm fire, but there's a couple of communities along the lakeshore that have very small school systems that can't find teachers, because the teacher's like, I got to live in Kalamazoo I can only afford to live in Kalamazoo, and you don't pay me enough to drive out there. So there's some structural things that kind of go into that, because of just sort of the dynamic makeup. And, you know, Ottawa's blessed in that, yes, we have the resort component, but there was a lot of pieces in place before that to kind of like buffer us from some of those harsher impacts. But I mean, when I got out of the Navy in 91, I moved to Saugatuck, and I was able to live in town and work at a restaurant. And that was, by the time I left a few years later, that was becoming really difficult, because it's just so hot.
Have you read Abundance or heard of it?
Yes, I have read Abundance.
Ezra Klein.
Yes. Have we all read Abundance? That was a hot one for this.
Yes, and he recommends a lot of the loosening up of the building codes, like you've talked about today. And he also talked about how the problem is worse in blue areas, blue cities, blue states, and how a state like Texas, that has hardly any zoning or even any building codes, has more building starts than like California and several other blue states combined.
Yeah.
But one other aspect I wanted to mention to you. My sister, my younger sister, one of her sons went on a big rant to her face about the baby boomers, and about how the baby boomers have always protected themselves with restrictive covenants and restrictive codes and other things. And so that she and her neighbors are all sitting on $1 million home, whatever, while he is paying thousands of dollars a month for rent, and will never be able to probably even afford a down payment, much less pay a mortgage. And my sister and her husband decided recently that they're probably each going to work an extra, probably 2 years so that they can provide kind of a nest egg to each of their 3 children to give them a chance to buy a home in California. And you've mentioned your son or a grandson. There is an intergenerational aspect to this. And I can understand my nephew's frustration.
Yeah, it's easy to kind of, I mean, I've lobbed my spitballs at boomers too. I'm not going to say I haven't, on full disclosure, but there are systemic pieces that were really baked into the cake, that have come about because housing and the business around it is a huge piece of the economy, and it is subject to the ups and downs of the economy, just like anything else. And one of the things when I worked at the museum, I was always one of my favorite lines was like, we're such a forward-moving people and have been since the beginning that we really think that like 5 years ago is a way long time ago. The housing crisis was not that long ago, all things considered, and we are still, manifesting some of the repercussions of that. Not to mention the extra layer of frosting we got from COVID. Had we not had those pieces come in through, had not things gone differently, this situation might not have existed. Loosening up of subprimes, it takes a while to back out of where you're at. And with housing costs, with the costs not being something that can be dealt with at this point, these zoning changes are going to be the key. And you're right, Houston housing starts are through the roof because their zoning is like, whatever you want to do, man, it's good. And that's really, when I look at Allegan County, the municipalities that are getting eyes on them are the ones that have in the last year thrown out all of their zoning and started over from scratch with the idea of what's going to put people in this town. And that needs to become the focus rather than some of the other things.
Any other questions? Well, I think we're a little bit past the time here.
Thank you very much
Thank
for your
you, Chris,
patience.
for the presentation. And we'll look forward to maybe talking to you again sometime.
Sometime I'd love to.
Thank you.